My name is Muttilainen, and I am the Director of the Interpretation Directorate of the Court of Justice of the European Union. I came to Luxembourg almost 30 years ago to work as an interpreter for the Court of Justice. I was nominated head of unit in 2007 for 7 languages, and I have been the director of the Interpretation Directorate since 2016. The Court of Justice is an institution, the role of which is to interpret EU law. And the parties may come from any of the 27 member states and may use any of the 24 official languages in front of this court. This means that the Court of Justice is a multilingual institution par excellence. In fact, I can't think of any other court of law which would work in so many languages as we do here on a daily basis. This linguistic diversity also means that interpretation is a part of the court's life and of the court's work. A vast majority, in fact, of the hearings will use simultaneous interpretation, if not all. The court does have one internal working language, though, which is French. If a preliminary reference comes from, let's say, Greece or Denmark, the case will all be translated, the case file will all be translated into French. The members of the court, their legal clerks, and the interpreters must therefore all be able to read French in order to prepare the cases, and the team of interpreters in a hearing will always include the French booth. This means also that French is our preferred relay and retour language at the court. How do we work and prepare for the hearings? Interpreters must have a thorough knowledge of all their working languages, of course, but the ability to analyze and understand the speaker's arguments is equally important. Precision here is essential, and prior study of the case file, which is available in the language of the case and in French, is an integral part of the interpreter's work. I always say that a good interpretation at the court takes 80% of preparation and 20% of work in the booth. Freelance interpreters, just as staff interpreters, have access to the complete case file, and they are expected to read it and to understand it. To the best of my knowledge, the court is the only institution or organization which recruits freelancers one day before the hearing and pays them the full day of preparation before the hearing. Our staff interpreters are, par la force des choses, very much specialized in legal interpreting. The court has 70 staff interpreters, and we are also relying on some 300 freelancers who are recruited from the joint list of interpreters accredited for the European institutions. When the freelancers come to the court, they are welcomed by our service with a case file. They will be given a room to study the case the day before the hearing, and they will, of course, also be in contact with the team. Whilst under contract to the court, freelancers are subject to the rules and regulations that apply to permanent staff, and they are bound, in particular, with secrecy with regard to information disclosed before and during the hearings. This is an essential element of the relationship of trust that have been established between interpreters and legal practitioners. And in fact, staff interpreters must also take an oath when joining the court. Now, you will have understood by now that the interpretation work is done here on the court's premises in Luxembourg. Now you might wonder if we ever use remote interpretation. As you know, many institutions switched to remote interpretation during the pandemic in order to be able just to continue their daily business. And the court was, of course, in a very similar situation. The hearings were resumed, yes, here in Luxembourg in May 2020, but at that time we also had travel restrictions which made it much more difficult. And we were, as the rest of the world, faced with those restrictions. That is why It was decided at the court back then that the parties who could not make it to Luxembourg because of these restrictions would be allowed to plead by video conference. It sounds very simple now, but the system was not easy to put into place. We needed to safeguard the confidentiality of the transmission, and at the same time we wanted to maintain good sound and image quality, because as we know, an interpreted meeting requires a significantly better sound quality than any other ordinary meeting. And that's why numerous tests were carried out and the parties had to contribute as well. They had to buy the required equipment and they had to take an active part in testing the material. I have to say that I was really impressed by this common effort made by our institutions and by all the speakers together to make the hearings work. Today, the same technical requirements and testing rules are part of the new rules of procedure of the General Court, which you can find on the court's website. The general rule of still coming physically to Luxembourg to plead is still in force. So what's there in the future for interpreters at the court? And what kind of interpreters are we looking for? I don't have a crystal ball, of course. But what the pandemic showed us is that there is a strong will to keep the court's hearings physically here in Luxembourg. The communication between the members of the court and the representatives of the parties and the governments, which is, let's not forget it, multilingual and even many times totally depending on interpretation, has to be as reliable as possible. What is at stake here are the rights of the defense. We don't really have room for technical problems during a hearing. What we need and what we are looking for are well-trained professional conference interpreters who are able to understand legal arguments and who are willing to spend hours in preparing a case. It's true that an interpreter with a keen interest in law will need a few cases to become an excellent interpreter at the court. But even newcomers can survive a case at the court. It just takes a lot of preparation, some courage, yes, and the help of colleagues, but that is something that I will promise you. And what about artificial intelligence then? Well, everybody is always very enthusiastic about new technologies. And I can understand that because I was also quite impressed when I saw how it can help the preparation work of interpreters. It can create documents which gather all the important information in one, or it can even create new glossaries. I would just be very careful about which documents you use in feeding in these tools. I would strongly advise to think twice, for example, before using them in preparing speeches, not to talk about pleadings. And why is that? Well, firstly, because the speakers are expecting confidentiality from interpreters. Secondly, a speech, in order to be interpreted correctly, has to be heard and understood during its delivery with all the aspects related to the intonation, to the body language, and even to the whole setting where the speech is given. And thirdly, according to me, an interpreter can do an excellent job only when he gets into the head of the speaker. Now, how could that happen if the translation that the interpreter is reading out or giving in the booth didn't even go through his own brain? I think you got my point. Yes, we still need excellent and dedicated conference interpreters who love what they are doing, which is conveying the content, the register and the intonation of the speaker from one language to another. I'm convinced that if we keep up training, if we value competence and curiosity, preparation and adaptability, interpreters will keep on bringing the added value to multilingual and multicultural communication. So I am expecting to see you very soon, I hope, here at the Court of Justice to do that work with us. Thank you.